There is a strange quiet settling over society right now, and most people do not know how to name it, but they feel it in their bones. It is the sound of absence, the echo left behind when something vital steps away and does not announce its departure. For years, we were told this moment would never come, that men would always be there, always adapt, always absorb the pressure, always return, no matter how they were treated. What no one prepared society for is what happens when men stop arguing, stop explaining, stop asking for permission, and simply leave. Stay with me until the very end of this video because once you see the full picture of what is unfolding, you will not be able to unsee it and you will understand why this shift is permanent. Before we go any further, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more Angry Guy content, and you want every single video the moment we release it. And if you want to learn how to protect yourself financially in a world that is changing fast, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. Inside the academy, I teach you how to protect and safeguard your assets, how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, and how to position yourself for long-term stability and growth. So go check that out now. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can always buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content coming. Now, let us talk about what no one wants to talk about openly, but everyone is starting to whisper about quietly. Women are grieving, not because men harmed them, not because men vanished overnight, but because men listened. For decades, men were told they were unnecessary, unwanted, outdated, and replaceable. They were told their presence was optional, their protection was oppressive, their leadership was toxic, and their silence was preferable to their voice. Eventually, men believed it. And belief becomes behavior. Men did not revolt. They did not burn anything down. They did not demand apologies. They simply stepped back. And now the grief has arrived, not all at once, but in waves, showing up in videos, posts, comments, and quiet moments of panic when reality sets in and there is no one to call. What we are seeing now is not a sudden crisis. It is delayed accountability. It is the natural result of choices made over decades, of incentives rewarded and consequences ignored. Women were told they could have everything without trade-offs, that time did not matter, that biology was negotiable, that community could be replaced with independence, and that men were a convenience rather than a cornerstone. Careers were framed as identity, relationships as optional, and family as something that could be postponed indefinitely without cost. For a while, that illusion held. But illusions collapse slowly, then all at once. And now many women are discovering something deeply unsettling, which is that without men, there is no stable foundation beneath them. A society without men does not look like a utopia. It looks like fragility disguised as freedom. It looks like empty apartments, quiet holidays, no emergency contact that is not a parent or sibling, no shared burden when life gets heavy. It looks like wealth that is earned but never anchored, success that has no one to share it with, and safety that feels conditional rather than guaranteed. Many women are now realizing that independence is not the same thing as resilience, and autonomy is not the same thing as security. Agency requires foresight, and foresight requires humility. And for a very long time, humility was framed as weakness. Men, on the other hand, learned a different lesson after years of being blamed, monitored, and pathologized. Men began to observe patterns instead of listening to narratives. They noticed that no matter how much they gave, it was never enough. And no matter how carefully they behaved, it was never safe. They noticed that effort was punished rather than rewarded, that loyalty was treated as entitlement, and that stability was framed as stagnation. Slowly, quietly, men stopped volunteering for roles that only came with risk and no upside. They stopped dating, stopped initiating, stopped paying, stopped explaining. And in doing so, they discovered something that shocked even them, which is that being alone is not the same thing as feeling lonely. Once men made peace with themselves, Once they stopped seeking validation from systems that profited from their guilt, something remarkable happened. Their stress levels dropped, their finances stabilized, their time became their own. They realized that much of what they were told they needed was actually draining them. Men are minimalist by nature, and when given permission to disengage, they cut away what does not serve them. They simplified their lives. They focused on health, hobbies, skills, and quiet competence. Many men are now living lives that are calm, ordered, and surprisingly fulfilling, not because they withdrew in bitterness, but because they chose peace over performance. This is where the grief begins on the other side, because women were not prepared for men to stop playing the game. Feminism promised empowerment, but delivered isolation. It promised liberation, but removed the very structures that made life sustainable. It told women they were the table, that their presence alone was enough, and that men were interchangeable accessories rather than partners. But tables without legs collapse. Presence without contribution breeds resentment. And now, many women are confronting a future that feels smaller, lonelier, and far more uncertain than the one they were promised. The cultural campaigns of the last 50 years did not just criticize bad behavior, they demonized masculinity itself. Boys grew up hearing that their instincts were dangerous, their energy was problematic, and their ambition was suspect. Normal behaviors were reframed as moral failings. Men were told how to sit, how to speak, how to look, and when to remain silent. Entire industries emerged around monitoring male behavior, documenting it, publicizing it, and punishing it socially. Systems like family court, divorce court, and civil litigation became tools of extraction rather than resolution, creating incentives for conflict rather than cooperation. Men watched as their lives could be dismantled by accusation alone, and they learned the lesson society was teaching them very clearly, which is that participation carried unacceptable risk. Public spaces became hostile. Gyms became minefields. Workplaces became legal exposure zones. Social interaction became a liability. Men were told not to approach, not to engage, not to lead, and not to withdraw. No behavior was safe, so many men chose no behavior at all. They opted out. And when enough men opt out, the consequences ripple outward. Dating markets collapse, birth rates fall, communities weaken, and yet instead of introspection, the response was confusion, anger, and denial. Women are now experiencing the world without the buffer men once provided. For generations, men absorbed the harshness of reality and shielded women from it, often without recognition or appreciation. Those days are over. Now, many women are encountering the full weight of responsibility alone. Financial stress feels heavier. Aging feels scarier. Health concerns feel more urgent. And the absence of a reliable partner is no longer theoretical, it is lived experience. The videos circulating online of women expressing exhaustion, fear, and frustration are not isolated incidents, they are signals. Signals of a system that was dismantled without a replacement ready. Men are not rushing back because they have learned something essential. The game was rigged. The rules changed mid play, the penalties were asymmetrical, and the rewards were conditional. So men stop playing. They trust their pattern recognition over promises. They trust observable reality over ideology. They no longer give attention, time, or money where it is not reciprocated with respect and stability. This is not punishment, it is self preservation. As society becomes more unstable, the contrast becomes sharper. Many men are quietly thriving, not in flashy ways, but in sustainable ones. They budget, they invest, they rest. They build routines that support long term health. They do not chase validation. They do not argue with narratives that do not serve them. They focus on what they can control. Meanwhile, many women are discovering that independence without infrastructure is exhausting, that freedom without foresight is fragile, that slogans do not hold you when life gets difficult. This is not about revenge, and it is not about cruelty. It is about cause and effect. Women told men to leave. Men listened. And now the grief is setting in, not because men disappeared, but because they found peace elsewhere. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. There is no grand return planned. There is no rescue coming. Men are not coming back to save systems that treated them as disposable. They are not rebuilding structures that punished them for participation. They are not re entering dynamics that cost them their health, wealth, and dignity. The future many women now face is one they were told would never happen: a future without children, a future without a partner to lean on during illness or hardship, a future that requires planning alone for old age, emergencies, and emotional weight. These realities are not punishments, they are outcomes. And outcomes do not care about intentions, only actions. Men walking away is not a phase, it is an adaptation. It is a rational response to incentives. And once an adaptation proves effective, it becomes permanent. Men have discovered that peace is not found in approval, but in alignment. That happiness is not found in sacrifice without appreciation, but in boundaries. That solitude can be rich, purposeful, and fulfilling when chosen consciously. So when you see the grief, understand what it really is. It is not mourning the loss of men, it is mourning the loss of leverage. It is the realization that the assumptions underpinning an entire cultural movement were wrong, that men were not endlessly resilient, endlessly forgiving, endlessly available. Men were simply patient, and patience, when exhausted, turns into departure. To understand where this is going, you have to understand what has already been lost, and not just in abstract terms. What disappeared first was trust. Trust is not a feeling, it is a pattern built over time. And once broken repeatedly, it does not regenerate just because someone decides they want it back. Men learned through lived experience that trust was treated as something they owed, not something that had to be earned. They were expected to trust systems that did not protect them, trust relationships that punished them for vulnerability, and trust narratives that blamed them for outcomes they did not control. Eventually, trust collapsed. And when trust collapses, participation follows. Men did not leave because they hated women, despite how often that accusation is repeated. Men left because the cost benefit equation no longer made sense. They left because effort was framed as entitlement, boundaries were framed as hostility, and self respect was framed as insecurity. They left because they noticed that no amount of compliance produced stability and no amount of sacrifice produced peace. Men are practical by nature. When something does not work, they stop investing in it. They do not need ideological justification, only evidence. And the evidence was overwhelming. And what women are experiencing now is not abandonment, it is the absence of expectation. For generations, women could assume that men would step in, step up, and step forward when things became difficult. That assumption shaped behavior. It reduced the perceived need for foresight. It encouraged short term thinking, emotional decision making, and the belief that consequences could always be deferred. When that assumption vanished, reality arrived unfiltered. Bills do not care about empowerment slogans. Time does not pause for personal growth arcs. Aging does not negotiate. Biology does not wait for career milestones. These truths were always present, but they were buffered. That buffer is gone. There is a profound difference between being alone by circumstance and being alone by design. Men who walk away are not isolated, they are selective. They build smaller circles. They prioritize peace over validation. They choose predictability over chaos. Many men now structure their lives to minimize exposure to unnecessary conflict. They invest in assets instead of appearances. They invest in skills instead of status. They invest in routines instead of drama. This is not retreat, it is recalibration. Meanwhile, many women were taught that boundaries were oppressive and accountability was optional. They were taught that discomfort was harm and that any friction signaled injustice. This created a fragile psychological framework that cannot withstand prolonged stress. When the world stopped accommodating those assumptions, anxiety increased, anger followed, and now grief is emerging. Not just grief for lost relationships, but grief for a worldview that no longer aligns with reality. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this shift is the idea that men walking away are angry or resentful. Most are not. Anger burns hot but short. What replaced it was clarity. Clarity is quieter. It does not announce itself, it simply changes behavior. Men stopped arguing online. They stopped debating narratives that did not serve them. They stopped trying to convince people who had already decided they were wrong. They focused inward, and that inward focus produced results. Financially, men who disengage from high conflict relationships retain more resources. Emotionally, they experience less volatility. Psychologically, they regain agency. When men are not constantly defending themselves, they can think long term. When they are not navigating unpredictable emotional environments, they can plan. When they are not being evaluated through hostile lenses, they can relax. Peace is not exciting, but it is powerful. Women now face a paradox they were never prepared for. They were promised independence would feel empowering at every stage of life. What many are discovering instead is that independence feels different at 25 than it does at 45. Time changes the meaning of choices. The options that feel abundant early on narrow later. Without a partner, without children, without a shared legacy, the future feels abstract and lonely. This realization does not come all at once. It arrives quietly, often late at night, when distractions fade and questions surface that cannot be silenced. There is also the practical reality of safety, not in dramatic terms, but in everyday ones. Who checks on you when you are sick? Who notices when something is wrong? Who helps when the unexpected happens? These questions used to have automatic answers. Now they require planning. Planning alone is exhausting. Planning without emotional support is heavier. Planning without shared responsibility is a burden many did not anticipate. Men understand this instinctively because they were always expected to plan. Men were expected to anticipate risk, to absorb shocks, to be the contingency plan. When men remove themselves, that responsibility does not disappear, it transfers. And many women are now feeling the full weight of that transfer for the first time. This is not cruelty, it is physics. Weight goes somewhere. The cultural narrative tried to erase the value men provided by framing it as oppressive. Protection became control, provision became manipulation, leadership became dominance, stability became boredom. In doing so, society removed the incentive for men to offer those things. You cannot tell someone they are harmful for decades and then be surprised when they stop showing up. Men listened. They internalized the message. They adjusted accordingly. What makes this moment irreversible is that men discovered something unexpected when they stepped away. They discovered that their lives improved, not dramatically in flashy ways, but consistently. Less stress, more savings, better sleep, better health, clearer goals. Men do not easily give up something that works. Once a man experiences peace after years of chaos, he becomes protective of it. He does not gamble it away lightly. This is why appeals to shame no longer work. Accusations of weakness, fear, or immaturity fall flat. Men know what they are choosing now. They have data. They have lived both realities. They are not guessing. And because of that, attempts to lure men back through guilt or panic will fail. You cannot scare someone out of a place they found relief. What we are witnessing is not a gender war, despite how it is framed online. It is a divergence. Two paths separating based on incompatible assumptions. Men are choosing realism, self preservation, and long term stability. Many women are still operating under frameworks built for a world that no longer exists. The friction comes from that mismatch. There is also a generational component. Younger men are watching older men and learning from their outcomes. They see the costs, they see the risks, they see the legal exposure, the financial losses, the emotional toll, and they adjust earlier. This means the trend will accelerate, not slow. Once behavior patterns become generational knowledge, they embed deeply. Social media amplifies this shift because it exposes contradictions. Men see women express frustration about loneliness while simultaneously dismissing the idea of compromise. Men see demands without reciprocity. Men see expectations without accountability. And instead of arguing, they disengage. Silence is a response, absence is feedback. Women often ask where the good men went. The uncomfortable answer is that they did exactly what they were told. They left. They focused on themselves. They built quiet lives away from constant scrutiny. They stopped offering value where it was not respected. And they are not advertising their absence because they do not need approval for it. This creates a feedback loop. As men leave, dating becomes more difficult. As dating becomes more difficult, frustration increases. As frustration increases, rhetoric becomes harsher. As rhetoric becomes harsher, more men leave. The system eats itself. And because the underlying assumptions remain unexamined, the cycle continues. It is important to understand that men are not against relationships. They are against unstable relationships. They are not against women. They are against systems that punish them for participation. If the environment were different, behavior would change. But environments are shaped by incentives, not intentions, and the incentives remain misaligned. The phrase men walking away is often misunderstood as bitterness. In reality, it is acceptance. Acceptance that certain dynamics cannot be fixed from one side. Acceptance that peace is preferable to performance. Acceptance that not every problem is yours to solve. This acceptance is what allows men to rest for the first time in years. Women grieving this shift are not wrong to feel pain. Pain is a signal, but pain does not rewrite reality. Regret does not reverse time, and nostalgia does not rebuild trust. The grief is real, but so is the cause. Healing begins with honesty, not denial. The hardest truth for many to accept is that men are not coming back to rescue anyone from the consequences of their choices. Not because men are cruel, but because rescue requires sacrifice without guarantee. And men have learned that sacrifice without appreciation leads to depletion. Depleted men cannot sustain societies. As systems strain and economies tighten, the contrast will grow. Men who conserve resources will fare better. Men who minimize exposure to chaos will adapt faster. Men who focused on self mastery will remain stable. This will create resentment, but resentment does not create change. Accountability does. We are entering a phase where observable reality overrides narrative, where lived outcomes matter more than slogans, where personal responsibility replaces collective blame. Men already made this shift. Many women have not yet caught up. The lag is painful. This conversation is uncomfortable because it exposes trade offs that were ignored for too long. It forces a reckoning with time, biology, and human nature. It challenges comforting myths, but discomfort is not harm, it is growth if it is allowed. Men walking away does not mean society collapses overnight. It means it changes shape. It means new norms emerge. It means expectations recalibrate. Whether that leads to renewal or further fragmentation depends on whether honesty replaces ideology. What is certain is that pretending nothing has changed will not work. Calling men names will not work. Demanding participation will not work. Respect precedes cooperation. Stability precedes trust. And trust cannot be commanded. We are only part way through this shift. The early signals are already clear. The long term outcomes will be even clearer. And the question is not whether men will return to the old model, but whether a new one can emerge that does not punish them for existing. When you zoom out far enough, what is happening stops looking emotional and starts looking structural. Societies run on cooperation, not sentiment, and cooperation only exists when incentives are aligned. For a long time, men were expected to cooperate regardless of incentive, regardless of outcome, regardless of personal cost. That expectation was never sustainable, but it persisted because men absorbed the damage quietly. What changed is not male nature, but tolerance thresholds. Once those thresholds were crossed, the system revealed how dependent it had been on unpaid emotional labor, unacknowledged risk, and silent endurance. One of the most dangerous myths ever sold was the idea that men and women experience time the same way. They do not. Men were always told to plan long term, delay gratification, and build before enjoying. Women were told they could defer consequences indefinitely. That mismatch is now colliding with reality. Time compresses options. What feels reversible in your 20s becomes fixed in your 40s. Men were trained to understand this early. Many women were not, because they were told every door stays open forever. Doors do not stay open, they close quietly without announcement. This is why the grief we are seeing now is not performative, even when it appears online. It is existential. It is the dawning realization that certain paths are no longer available, not because of oppression, but because of chronology. Men walking away did not create this problem, they simply stopped compensating for it. For decades, male presence softened the landing of bad decisions, removed that cushion, and the ground feels harder. Men did not suddenly become disciplined or intentional. They always were. What changed is where that discipline is applied. Instead of applying it to relationships that yielded diminishing returns, they redirected it toward personal stability. Men learned to live below their means, to invest patiently, to value quiet competence over visible success. This makes them harder to manipulate and easier to overlook. But it also makes them resilient. Meanwhile, many women were socialized to pursue visibility rather than durability. Attention was mistaken for security. Validation was mistaken for value. This worked in an environment where attention could be converted into opportunity. That conversion rate is collapsing. Attention does not pay rent. Visibility does not provide care. Likes do not replace legacy. And the longer this takes to sink in, the more painful the adjustment becomes. The collapse of dating is not about romance, it is about trust infrastructure. Dating only works when both sides believe participation is safe. Men no longer believe that. They believe that any misstep can be amplified, recorded, reframed, and used against them. Even if that happens rarely, the risk is asymmetric. Men assess risk. When the downside outweighs the upside, they opt out. This is rational behavior, not emotional retreat. You cannot shame someone into assuming risk they have already calculated. You cannot insult someone into volunteering vulnerability. You cannot demand trust from someone who learned the cost of trusting the wrong system. This is why messaging has failed. The language is outdated. It assumes leverage that no longer exists. There is also a deeper layer few want to acknowledge. Many men walking away are not doing so out of fear, but out of contentment. Contentment is the enemy of control. Content man is not easily provoked. He does not need approval. He does not seek conflict. He is not motivated by status games. This makes him invisible to systems built on agitation. This invisibility is misinterpreted as absence, but it is more accurate to call it withdrawal. Men are still here. They are just not where they used to be. They are not in comment sections arguing. They are not in dating apps competing. They are not in workplaces overperforming for recognition. They are building parallel lives that require less negotiation. Women now confronting this shift often feel disoriented because they were never taught how much of their perceived security was externally maintained. When that maintenance stops, anxiety follows. This anxiety is then externalized as anger or disbelief. Surely this is temporary. Surely men will return. Surely the pendulum will swing back. But pendulums only swing back if the force remains. The force is gone. The reality is that many men have already redesigned their lives around permanent independence. They have structured finances to avoid shared liabilities. They have built routines that do not rely on emotional unpredictability. They have accepted solitude not as deprivation, but as freedom. You cannot easily reinsert chaos into a system optimized for calm. This creates a strange inversion. Men who were once criticized as avoidant are now the most stable people in the room. Women who were once celebrated as liberated now feel constrained by choices they were told were empowering. This inversion generates resentment, but resentment does not change physics. Cause precedes effect. Another uncomfortable truth is that many of the behaviors now criticized in men were learned responses. Men did not become guarded spontaneously, they became guarded after observing patterns. They did not stop committing because they feared intimacy. They stopped committing because commitment no longer guaranteed reciprocity. Men adapt. They always have. There is a tendency to frame this as men abandoning responsibility. In reality, men have simply narrowed the scope of responsibility they are willing to carry alone. Responsibility without authority is exploitation. Responsibility without appreciation is erosion. Responsibility without safety is foolish. Men learned this the hard way. Society often praises resilience while punishing those who display it. Men were praised for enduring pressure, then blamed for being distant. They were praised for working, then criticized for prioritizing work. They were praised for stoicism, then accused of emotional unavailability. These contradictions cannot coexist indefinitely. Men resolved the contradiction by opting out. The silence that followed was misread as apathy. It was not. It was recalibration. Men reassessed what was worth their energy. They realized that many arguments were unwinnable because the rules shifted constantly. So they stopped arguing. They realized that many expectations were unfillable because they were undefined. So they stopped trying. Women grieving this loss often do so without fully understanding what was lost. They miss not just companionship, but structure. They miss predictability. They miss shared responsibility. They miss the invisible labor men perform to keep life functioning smoothly. When that labor disappears, its value becomes apparent. This is why you see a rise in content expressing exhaustion. Not dramatic exhaustion, but cumulative exhaustion. The exhaustion of always having to think ahead alone, of always having to be strong, of always having to self soothe. Independence sounds empowering until you realize it never clocks out. Men understand this because they lived it. They carried responsibility as a default. When they chose to put it down, the relief was immediate. Relief is addictive. Men do not easily give up relief. This shift also changes how men view relationships. Relationships are no longer central to identity, they are optional enhancements. This dramatically alters standards. Men no longer tolerate instability in exchange for intimacy. They no longer accept disrespect in exchange for companionship. The baseline has risen, not fallen. For women accustomed to being the selector, this feels like loss of control. It is. But control built on imbalance was never stable. When balance returns, power equalizes. Equalization feels like deprivation to those accustomed to leverage. This is not a moral judgment, it is observation. Systems recalibrate when imbalances are removed. The recalibration phase is uncomfortable. Another factor accelerating this trend is economic pressure. As costs rise and margins shrink, inefficiency becomes visible. Men can no longer afford relationships that drain resources without providing stability. They prioritize efficiency. Efficiency is not romantic, but it is necessary. Men walking away are not rejecting connection. They are rejecting fragility. They are rejecting chaos. They are rejecting systems that require them to constantly prove innocence. They are rejecting narratives that frame them as problems to be managed rather than partners to be respected. Women who wish to understand this moment must move past slogans and into analysis. They must examine incentives honestly. They must ask not what feels fair, but what works, what produces stability, what produces trust, what produces mutual benefit. Trust will not be rebuilt through nostalgia. It will not be rebuilt through blame. It will only be rebuilt through demonstrated change, consistency, accountability, predictability. Men respond to patterns, not promises. Until then, men will continue walking away quietly. They will continue choosing peace over performance. They will continue building lives that do not require validation from systems that failed them. This is not the end of relationships. It is the end of illusions. It is the end of one sided expectations. It is the end of assuming endless male availability. What replaces it is still forming, and whether it becomes healthier or more fragmented depends on whether reality is acknowledged or resisted. Adaptation is the word most people avoid because adaptation requires surrendering old assumptions. It requires admitting that what once worked no longer does, and that clinging to familiar narratives will not restore lost stability. Men adapted first because they had to. The environment forced it. The cost of remaining unchanged became too high. When adaptation produces better outcomes, it becomes reinforced. That reinforcement is now visible across behavior patterns. Not slogans or opinions, but choices repeated consistently over time. What many people still misunderstand is that men walking away did not remove themselves from society. They removed themselves from roles that expose them to disproportionate risk. They are still working, still contributing, still building, but they are doing so on terms that protect their long term well being. They are choosing solitude over volatility, predictability over passion, and sustainability over intensity. These choices do not make headlines, but they compound quietly. This quiet compounding is what makes the shift so destabilizing to those who expected constant male engagement. Systems that relied on men's emotional and financial surplus without providing security in return are now discovering they were undercapitalized. They ran deficits masked by male tolerance. Once that tolerance evaporated, the deficit surfaced. One of the most revealing aspects of this transition is how differently men and women interpret loneliness. Men often experience loneliness as a temporary state that can be addressed through purpose. Women often experience loneliness as an identity threat. This difference matters. Men can endure solitude if it feels meaningful. Women struggle with solitude when it feels permanent. As men redefine purpose outside relationships, solitude becomes sustainable. As women confront permanence without preparation, distress increases. The response to this distress has largely been externalization. Blame the economy, blame social media, blame men, blame timing. Rarely is the underlying incentive structure examined. Rarely is the possibility considered that men made a rational choice based on available information. Acknowledging that would require acknowledging that the system failed them first. Reconciliation, if it is to happen at all, cannot be emotional, it must be structural. It must address risk asymmetry, accountability imbalance, and trust erosion. Men will not re enter environments where their downside remains unlimited while their upside remains conditional. Any appeal that ignores this will fail, regardless of how emotionally compelling it sounds. There is also a myth that men walking away are avoiding responsibility. In truth, many are assuming responsibility in a narrower, more sustainable way. They are responsible for themselves, their health, their finances, and their peace. They are no longer volunteering to be responsible for chaos they did not create and cannot control. This is not abandonment, it is boundary setting. And boundaries are uncomfortable for those accustomed to access. When access is removed, it feels like punishment, but access was never guaranteed. It was granted under certain assumptions. When those assumptions changed, access logically followed. Another uncomfortable reality is that many women were not encouraged to cultivate traits that sustain long term partnership. They were encouraged to maximize short term leverage. This worked in environments where leverage could be converted into commitment. That conversion rate has collapsed. Leverage without conversion becomes resentment. Resentment does not attract stability. Men notice this early. They notice that negotiation replaced cooperation, that demands replaced collaboration, that relationships felt like audits rather than alliances. Men are builders. Builders require predictability. When predictability disappears, builders disengage. The collapse of shared narratives around family has compounded this issue. Family was once framed as a shared project requiring sacrifice from both sides. That framing eroded. Family became optional, then inconvenient, then burdensome. Once framed that way, it lost its power as a unifying goal. Men who still value family now seek environments where it is respected, not treated as an obstacle. Many men walking away are not rejecting family. They are rejecting environments hostile to it. They understand that raising children requires stability, cooperation, and mutual respect. They refuse to gamble that responsibility on systems that devalue them, and this refusal is not loud, it is quiet. And quiet shifts are the hardest to reverse because they do not announce themselves until they are entrenched. There is also a psychological dimension that deserves attention. Men were told repeatedly that expressing needs was weakness. When they finally stopped expressing them and instead acted, they were criticized for disengagement. This contradiction taught men that communication was a liability. Action became safer. Silence became protective. Once silence proves effective, it spreads. Men observe other men thriving quietly. They imitate what works. This creates cultural momentum that cannot be stopped by messaging alone. Women now facing this momentum often attempt to negotiate emotionally, but negotiation requires leverage. Leverage requires demand. Demand has shifted. Men no longer demand relationships the way they once did. Without demand, negotiation collapses. This is why appeals to nostalgia fall flat. Nostalgia assumes shared desire. That assumption no longer holds. Men desire peace more than partnership, unless partnership enhances peace. This is a high bar, but it is not arbitrary. It is learned. The economic implications of this shift are significant. Household formation slows. Consumption patterns change. Men spend less on status signaling and more on durability. This affects markets, housing, and long term planning. Societies built on dual income households must recalibrate when those households do not form. The demographic implications are even more profound. Declining birth rates are not a mystery, they are a consequence of instability. Men will not invest in futures they cannot secure. Women cannot create families alone without cost. The gap widens. These are not moral failures, they are logistical realities. Biology and economics do not bend to ideology. Men walking away have also discovered something counterintuitive. When they stop chasing validation, they become more selective. Selectivity changes power dynamics. It shifts who initiates, who compromises, and who adapts. This shift is deeply uncomfortable for those who benefited from asymmetry. Comfort with asymmetry breeds entitlement. Entitlement collapses when symmetry returns. The collapse feels like injustice to those who never examined the imbalance. It is important to note that none of this precludes healthy relationships. It simply raises the bar. Healthy relationships require mutual investment, clear expectations, and shared goals. Men are willing to meet those standards. What they are unwilling to do is subsidize dysfunction. This is why many men are open to relationships in theory, but uninterested in practice. Theory does not carry risk, practice does. Until practice becomes safer, theory remains hypothetical. Women who genuinely wish to understand this moment must ask difficult questions. What behaviors increase trust? What structures reduce risk? What accountability mechanisms protect both sides? These questions are rarely asked because they challenge comfortable narratives. Men have already answered these questions for themselves. Their answers are visible in their choices: less engagement, more boundaries, greater focus on self mastery. Self mastery is not isolation, it is alignment. Men are aligning their actions with outcomes they can control. This reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety increases clarity. Clarity reinforces alignment. This feedback loop is powerful. Women experiencing distress often lack an equivalent loop because their strategies were optimized for a different environment. Reoptimization takes time. Time is scarce. The tragedy is not that men walked away. The tragedy is that the warning signs were ignored. Men communicated discomfort for years. They were told their discomfort was illegitimate. When communication failed, behavior changed. Behavior always speaks louder. Now, society is listening to behavior and calling it a crisis. It is not a crisis, it is a correction. Corrections are uncomfortable. They expose inefficiencies. They redistribute costs. They remove illusions. But they also create opportunity for healthier systems to emerge. Whether that opportunity is seized depends on honesty: honesty about trade offs, honesty about incentives, honesty about human nature. Men are not villains for protecting themselves. Women are not villains for feeling grief, but neither emotion rewrites reality. Only adaptation does. We are entering an era where stability will be valued over excitement, predictability over intensity, and cooperation over performance. Men are already there. Others are catching up. The question is not whether men walking away will stop. It will not. The question is whether society will adapt to their absence in certain roles or continue pretending nothing has changed. Denial prolongs pain, acceptance shortens it. Realistic adaptation begins with abandoning the fantasy that things will simply revert to how they were. History does not rewind to comfort those who feel unprepared. It moves forward, indifferent to preference. Men understand this instinctively because they have always been taught to deal with what is, not what should be. That mindset is now shaping the future more than any ideology or movement. Men walking away did not do so impulsively. They tested the alternative, measured the outcomes, and adjusted accordingly. Once the results became undeniable, the decision locked in. For individuals, adaptation means accepting that certain paths close when others are chosen. This is not punishment, it is trade off. Trade offs exist in every domain except the one modern culture pretended was exempt. Relationships were framed as optional until they were suddenly irreplaceable. Families were framed as burdens until their absence became palpable. Community was framed as unnecessary until isolation became widespread. Men saw these contradictions early because they were expected to absorb the consequences. When they stopped absorbing them, the contradictions surfaced for everyone else. A major obstacle to adaptation is pride. Pride resists reevaluation. Pride insists that discomfort must be someone else's fault. Pride demands restoration without reform. But systems do not respond to pride. They respond to pressure and incentive. Men walking away removed pressure from themselves and redirected it outward. That pressure is now being felt elsewhere, often by those who assumed it would never reach them. There's also a fundamental misunderstanding about male motivation that continues to distort this conversation. Men are not motivated by domination, despite how often that claim is repeated. They are motivated by purpose, progress, and peace. When relationships provided those things, men pursued them relentlessly. When relationships became sources of instability, risk, and constant negotiation, men disengaged. Motivation follows reward. This is not ideological, it is biological. The idea that men can be shamed back into engagement misunderstands shame itself. Shame only works on those who still care about the approval of the group applying it. Men who have walked away no longer seek that approval. They replaced it with self respect. Self respect is not loud, it does not announce itself, it simply refuses to be negotiated away. This refusal is what many find unsettling. It removes leverage. Without leverage, narratives lose power. Without power, accountability returns to the individual. This is where discomfort intensifies. Accountability feels heavy when it has been deferred for decades. Another barrier to adaptation is the belief that compromise means loss. In healthy systems, compromise means mutual adjustment. In unhealthy systems, compromise means unilateral concession. Men experience the latter repeatedly. They learned that compromise often meant giving more while receiving less. Once they recognized that pattern, they stopped participating. You cannot compromise with a system that only moves in one direction. For women seeking genuine connection in this new landscape, the challenge is not competition with other women, but recalibration of expectations. Expectations formed in one environment do not translate cleanly into another. Men no longer compete for access the way they once did. This changes the entire dynamic. Attraction becomes less about visibility and more about compatibility. Compatibility requires alignment in values, not just preferences. Men now prioritize predictability over excitement because predictability supports long term planning. This does not mean men reject passion, it means they reject volatility. There is a difference. Passion that enhances stability is welcome, passion that destabilizes it is avoided. This distinction is subtle but crucial. One of the reasons adaptation is so difficult is because it requires letting go of narratives that once provided identity. Identity loss is painful. It feels like erasure, but clinging to an outdated identity is worse. It creates friction between who you are and the world you inhabit. Men resolve this friction by redefining themselves. Others are still resisting. This resistance manifests as denial, anger, and bargaining. Surely this is a phase. Surely men will return once conditions improve. Surely something external will fix this. But external fixes do not repair internal misalignment. The issue is not temporary conditions, it is structural mismatch. Men walking away is not a protest, it is a signal. Signals can be ignored for a time, but not indefinitely. The longer they are ignored, the more drastic the adjustment becomes. There is also a misconception that men walking away means men reject intimacy altogether. That is not accurate. Men reject unstable intimacy. They reject intimacy that comes with asymmetric risk. They reject intimacy that requires constant self censorship. They reject intimacy that frames them as problems to be managed rather than partners to be trusted. Trust is the core currency here. Without trust, no amount of attraction matters. Trust requires consistency. Consistency requires accountability. Accountability requires consequences. These elements were systematically removed in the name of comfort. Comfort eroded resilience. Resilience eroded cooperation. Men rebuilt trust internally first. They learned to trust themselves. They learned to trust their judgment. They learned to trust patterns over promises. This internal trust made external trust optional rather than necessary. Once trust becomes optional, its value changes. Women experiencing grief often interpret this as abandonment, but abandonment implies obligation. Men no longer accept obligations that expose them to disproportionate harm. This does not mean men owe nothing. It means obligation must be reciprocal. Reciprocity is not transactional, it is structural. It means both sides bear risk and reward proportionally. When reciprocity disappears, systems collapse. We are now witnessing the collapse phase of a system that relied on hidden subsidies. Male tolerance was one of those subsidies. Once removed, the true cost of certain behaviors becomes visible. Visibility is uncomfortable. It reveals imbalances that were previously masked. It exposes assumptions that were never tested. It forces confrontation with reality. Reality does not negotiate, it simply exists. The future will not be shaped by those who shout the loudest, but by those who adapt most effectively. Men have already adapted. They are not waiting for permission. They are not seeking validation. They are building lives aligned with reality as it is. And this does not mean women are doomed. It means adaptation is required on both sides. But adaptation must be grounded in honesty, not nostalgia. It must acknowledge trade offs, not deny them. Healthy cooperation is still possible, but it will not resemble the past. It will be more deliberate, more selective, more grounded, less performative. Men will engage where trust is demonstrable, where accountability is shared, where expectations are clear, where peace is protected. This is not a loss, it is an evolution. Evolution is always uncomfortable in the transition phase. Those who adapt thrive, those who resist struggle. We are not at the end of this shift. We are in the middle. The outcomes are still forming, but the direction is clear. Long term equilibrium is not something that arrives dramatically. It emerges quietly, shaped by thousands of individual decisions rather than grand declarations. By the time most people notice it, it has already settled in. That is where we are headed now. The patterns are stabilizing, even if the emotions around them are still volatile. Men have largely completed their adjustment phase. They have tested solitude, independence, and selective engagement, and many have found those states not just tolerable, but preferable. That preference is what defines the new baseline. Equilibrium does not mean harmony. It means balance of forces. It means incentives align closely enough with outcomes that behavior becomes predictable again. For years, predictability eroded. Men could not predict how effort would be received, how intentions would be interpreted, or how commitment would be rewarded. Unpredictable environments produce risk aversion. Risk aversion produces withdrawal. Withdrawal reshapes equilibrium. This is not ideology, it is systems behavior. The new equilibrium places a premium on self sufficiency. Men who once derived identity from being needed now derive identity from being prepared. Prepared for economic shifts, prepared for solitude, prepared for uncertainty. This preparation reduces fear. Reduced fear changes behavior. Men no longer chase security through relationships, they generate it internally. Women, by contrast, were often encouraged to externalize security, to believe that systems, networks, or narratives would absorb risk on their behalf. That belief is now colliding with reality. External buffers are thinner. Institutional trust is lower. Social cohesion is weaker. The skills required to navigate this environment are not the ones most heavily promoted over the past several decades. This mismatch creates anxiety, but anxiety alone does not produce adaptation. Adaptation requires clarity. Clarity requires honesty. Honesty requires abandoning comforting myths. One of those myths is that everything lost can be regained with enough emotional appeal. That is not how trust works. Trust is rebuilt through consistent behavior over time, not through urgency or regret. Men who have recalibrated their lives are not unmoved by suffering. They simply refuse to internalize responsibility for outcomes they did not create. Empathy does not require self sacrifice. Compassion does not require exposure to harm. These distinctions matter now more than ever. Another myth that must be addressed is the idea that men walking away represent a failure of masculinity. In reality, it represents a refinement of it. Masculinity has always been adaptive. It has always prioritized survival, competence, and long term viability. When old expressions of masculinity became liabilities, new ones emerged. Quiet strength replaced performative strength. Boundaries replaced bravado. Discernment replaced endurance. This evolution unsettles those who benefited from the old model. When men perform strength publicly, it could be exploited. When men internalize strength privately, it cannot. This shifts power away from spectacle and towards substance. Equilibrium also changes how conflict is handled. Men who walk away do not escalate, they disengage. Disengagement deprives conflict of oxygen. Without reaction, provocation loses purpose. Over time, this reduces the prevalence of conflict driven by attention seeking. Silence becomes a corrective force. This silence is often misinterpreted as indifference. It is not. It is intentional restraint. Men learned that not every battle deserves participation. Energy conserved is energy invested elsewhere. This principle compounds. The long term impact of this shift on relationships is significant. Relationships that do form will be fewer, but more deliberate. They will prioritize alignment over attraction, stability over novelty, shared responsibility over emotional intensity. These relationships will look quieter from the outside, but they will be more durable. This durability will feel inaccessible to those still operating under old assumptions. The gap between expectations and outcomes will widen until expectations are adjusted. Adjustment is uncomfortable, but inevitable. Another unavoidable lesson emerging from this transition is the cost of ignoring trade offs. Trade offs were framed as oppressive constraints rather than natural limits. This framing delayed adaptation. Delays increase pain. The longer trade offs are denied, the harsher they feel when they finally assert themselves. When men adapted earlier because they were exposed to consequences earlier, exposure accelerates learning, insulation delays it. This is not about intelligence or virtue, it is about feedback loops. Men received feedback, they adjusted, others did not receive feedback until much later. This delay explains much of the current grief. Grief is not just for lost relationships, but for lost time. Time is the one resource that cannot be replenished. When people realize time has been spent pursuing unstable strategies, regret follows. Regret is heavy because it cannot be outsourced. Men walking away removed one of the last mechanisms that soften regret. Without that buffer, regret surfaces fully. This is painful, but it is also clarifying. Clarification is what enables real change. Without clarity, efforts remain scattered and reactive. With clarity, priorities reorder. What once felt essential is revealed as optional. What once felt optional is revealed as essential. For many men, peace was revealed as essential. Not pleasure, not excitement, peace. Peace enables planning, peace enables growth, peace enables health. Men discovered that peace was incompatible with constant relational volatility. They chose accordingly. This choice does not make men immune to loneliness, but it changes how loneliness is processed. Loneliness becomes a signal to strengthen purpose, not a mandate to seek attachment at any cost. This reframing is powerful. Women who adapt successfully will undergo a similar reframing. They will distinguish between desire and dependency, between companionship and validation, between connection and control. This distinction is difficult because it challenges deeply ingrained narratives, but it is necessary. The future equilibrium will reward those who cultivate internal stability first. External stability follows internal order, not the other way around. This principle applies to individuals and societies alike. Societies that rely on unpaid emotional labor and unacknowledged risk eventually destabilize. Once exposed, they must either reform or fragment. Reform requires acknowledging what was taken for granted. Fragmentation occurs when denial persists. We are at a crossroads where both outcomes remain possible. Reform would require rebuilding trust infrastructure, recalibrating incentives, and restoring reciprocity. Fragmentation would mean further divergence, parallel lives, and reduced cooperation. Men are prepared for either outcome because they have already reduced dependence on external systems. This preparedness gives them leverage without confrontation. Leverage through optionality is the most stable form of power. Optionality changes behavior. When participation is optional, it must be earned. This shifts responsibility back to systems and individuals that once assumed guaranteed engagement. That assumption is gone. Another lesson emerging from this shift is the importance of foresight. Foresight was often dismissed as pessimism. It is not. It is respect for reality. Men were trained to forecast risk. That training now pays dividends. Others must develop it quickly or bear higher costs. Foresight does not mean fear. It means preparation. Prepared individuals experience less panic because fewer outcomes surprise them. Panic thrives in unpredictability. Preparation dissolves it. As equilibrium settles, narratives will change. They always do. What is now framed as abandonment will later be framed as independence. What is now framed as crisis will later be framed as transition. Language follows outcomes, not the other way around. The people who thrive in this new equilibrium will be those who accept responsibility without resentment, those who plan without bitterness, those who adapt without nostalgia. Men walking away are often portrayed as disengaged from society. In reality, they are deeply engaged with reality. They simply refuse to engage with illusions. This makes them appear detached to those still invested in narratives. Detachment is not apathy, it is discernment. Discernment is the ability to choose where to invest energy. Energy invested wisely compounds. Energy wasted does not. This is why men who walk away often appear calmer. Calm is a byproduct of alignment. Alignment between values and actions reduces internal conflict. Reduced internal conflict frees cognitive resources. Freed resources enable growth. Growth is occurring quietly. Men are improving health metrics, financial stability, and emotional regulation. These improvements are not broadcast because they do not require validation. They are self reinforcing. Women who successfully adapt will experience similar reinforcement, but adaptation requires letting go of expectations formed in a different environment. Letting go feels like loss, but holding on produces stagnation. Stagnation is more painful than loss over time. Loss hurts sharply, then fades. Stagnation hurts slowly, then permanently. Many are choosing between these pains now. The men who walked away already chose loss. They lost access, validation, and familiarity. In return, they gained peace, clarity, and stability. That trade off proved favorable. They will not reverse it lightly. This is why calls for return sound hollow. They ask men to surrender gains without guaranteeing protection. Men do not gamble proven stability for unproven promises. Promises are cheap, patterns are expensive. Men trust patterns. As we move toward the final phase of this discussion, it becomes clear that the future is not about restoring what was lost, but about building what was missing: mutual respect, shared accountability, predictable systems, clear incentives. These are not romantic ideals, they are functional requirements. Without them, men will continue walking away. With them, some may return, selectively and cautiously. The outcome is not predetermined. but the direction of adaptation is. At the center of everything discussed so far is a truth that many people resist because it removes the comfort of blame and replaces it with responsibility. Reality does not negotiate with ideology. It does not care about intentions, narratives, or how strongly something was believed. Reality responds only to behavior repeated over time. Men adjusted their behavior. Society is now responding to that adjustment. This is not a moral verdict, it is an outcome. What men discovered, often to their own surprise, is that peace is not something that must be earned through sacrifice. Peace is something that emerges when sacrifice is aligned with appreciation and reciprocity. When that alignment disappeared, peace disappeared with it. Men did not destroy peace. They withdrew from environments where peace was impossible. This distinction matters because it reframes the entire conversation. Walking away was not an act of defiance, it was an act of preservation. Preservation is a concept that modern culture struggles to respect because it is quiet and unglamorous. Preservation does not generate applause, it does not trend, it does not feel heroic, but it is essential. Men preserved their health, their finances, their time, and their emotional bandwidth. In doing so, they preserved their future. A future that no longer depends on approval or participation in unstable systems. The most revealing aspect of this shift is how quickly many men stabilized once they disengaged. Stress levels normalized, sleep improved, focus returned, long term planning became possible again. These outcomes are not accidents, they are indicators. They signal that previous conditions were incompatible with human well being. Men removed themselves from those conditions and recovered. This is data, not opinion. What unsettles many observers is that men are not expressing regret. They are not asking to be welcomed back. They are not negotiating terms. They are living quietly. Contentment without permission disrupts systems built on leverage. When people are content, they are harder to control. Control requires dissatisfaction. Men are no longer dissatisfied in the ways they once were. This does not mean men are indifferent to connection. It means connection must now meet a higher standard. It must add to stability rather than subtract from it. It must reduce friction rather than create it. It must feel like cooperation rather than compliance. These standards are not punitive, they are protective. Women facing the consequences of the shift are not experiencing cruelty, they are experiencing exposure. Exposure to realities that were previously softened, exposure to trade offs that were previously hidden, exposure to the limits of narratives that promised endless flexibility. Exposure is uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. Clarification is what allows people to make better decisions going forward. But clarity often arrives too late to recover everything that was lost. This is where grief becomes unavoidable. Grief for time, grief for assumptions, grief for futures imagined but no longer accessible. Grief is not weakness, it is acknowledgement, but acknowledgement alone does not create change. Change requires humility. Humility requires accepting that some beliefs were wrong, that some advice was incomplete, that some choices carried costs that were ignored. This is difficult because it challenges identity. Identity loss feels like annihilation, but identity can be rebuilt. Time cannot. Men rebuilt identity first. They detached it from external validation and anchored it internally. This anchoring reduced volatility. Reduced volatility increased confidence. Confidence made external approval optional. Optionality is power. This power is not loud, it does not seek dominance, it simply refuses to be coerced. Coercion fails when participation is voluntary. Men made participation voluntary. That single decision reshaped everything. The long term consequences of this will extend beyond relationships. They will affect economies, demographics, and social structures. Systems will adapt or fail. Individuals will adapt or struggle. The difference will be foresight. Foresight is not pessimism, it is respect for cause and effect. Men were taught cause and that effect early because they bore consequences early. Others are learning now. Learning late is painful, but it is still learning. One of the most important lessons emerging from this moment is that stability is not automatic. It is built, it is maintained, and it is fragile when taken for granted. Men were once the default stabilizers. When they stepped back, the absence revealed how much weight they carried quietly. This revelation is not an indictment, it is information. Information can be used to build better systems or ignored until collapse. The choice remains. There is still a path toward healthier cooperation, but it requires abandoning entitlement, embracing reciprocity, and rebuilding trust through behavior rather than rhetoric. Trust is slow to build and fast to break. Men know this now more than ever. Any future cooperation must begin with safety. Safety for both sides. Safety means predictable rules, fair accountability, and proportional risk. Without safety, engagement will remain limited, and the era of assumed male availability is over. Availability must be earned through respect, stability, and alignment. This is not exclusion, it is selection. Selection is how resilient systems function. They reward behaviors that sustain the system and discourage those that erode it. Men adjusted to selection pressures. Others must now do the same. This transition will not be evenly distributed. Some will adapt quickly. Some will resist until the cost becomes unbearable. Some will never adapt and will suffer quietly. This is not justice or injustice, it is variance. What matters for anyone watching this is understanding where you are in that process. Are you clinging to expectations formed in a world that no longer exists, or are you recalibrating based on observable reality? Are you waiting for restoration, or are you building something new? Men who walked away did not wait. They built slowly, quietly, intentionally. They accepted loss in exchange for stability. That trade off worked. This does not mean everyone must make the same choice, but it does mean the old assumptions are no longer reliable. Acting as if they are will only increase frustration. And as we move forward, conversations like this will become more common because the outcomes are becoming harder to ignore. Silence will no longer conceal the shift. Data will accumulate, patterns will solidify, language will follow. Eventually, the grief phase will pass, acceptance will replace it, and after acceptance, adaptation will accelerate. The question is, how much damage occurs in the meantime? The men who walked away are not waiting for apologies. They are not waiting for permission. They are not waiting for validation. They are living. And that reality is the most disruptive thing of all. Before we close, I want to ask you directly, what did you think about what was discussed, in this video? Do you agree? And how do you see this shift playing out in your own life or the lives of people around you? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts, because this conversation is not going away, and hearing different perspectives matters. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.